In the closing decades of the 20th century, after centuries of mutual trade and peaceful interaction, two ethnic groups in the West African country of Ivory Coast suddenly came into conflict. The Senufo, a farming community, began to interact violently with the Fulani, a community of pastoralists and cattle herders who we met earlier in the course. Cattle theft, arson, and murder broke out throughout the Sahel as the two groups retaliated against one another in an ongoing struggle. Why? Now, it'd be tempting to think that ancient ethnic hatred sparked these conflicts, but in fact, the two groups have traded peacefully and interacted with one another for centuries. Maybe then local environmental conditions led to the conflict. There had been a period of really long drought prior to these conflicts, after all, so perhaps dying herds and resource scarcity was the driver. But Ivory Coast is a relatively land-abundant place, and in fact, herds were actually booming at this time. So what the heck happened here? The actual causes are considerably more complicated. As geographer Tom Bassett discovered during his many years of fieldwork amongst both of these communities, the flashpoint for conflict had roots very far away. As it turns out, the tit-for-tat violence in Ivory Coast was set off by the heavy crop damage in Senufo fields caused by larger than usual Fulani herds moving through the region. Why? Well, these migrations were in turn encouraged by a very carefully supervised and carefully orchestrated national plan. The national plan was to increase meat exports by luring Fulani herders to bring more and more animals to market from Mali and Burkina Faso to the processing zones of Ivory Coast. But why? Well, because the Ivorian government was faced with an enormously steep foreign loan to pay. Really severe fiscal austerity was imposed by multinational lending agencies, and a crisis came about in the availability of capital. So by forming a massive taxable income stream through meat exports, the government hoped to dig its way out of a global debt crisis. So as a result, unprecedented numbers of cattle moved through the region, destroyed local farms, and touched off a bloody conflict that would take years to wind down. You see, there was a hidden price paid in financing the debt placed on Ivory Coast and the seemingly clever meat export scheme invented to address it. That price was paid in a messy conflict over resources fought between local rural people in distant parts of the country. What this means is that local and place-based environmental problems or crises or conflicts are often at the tail end of a chain of decisions and pressures in a larger global web. The spatial relationships in a complex international system like meat exports and circulating African debt, in other words, these often heavily influence the local environmental conditions of a place. In this case, turning old friends into new enemies. So following in this line of thinking, in this lecture, I'm going to introduce an approach used by many geographers to help explain these kinds of local environmental problems or crises. By tracing their causes to prior and wider scale interactions, this approach, which is called political ecology, is a kind of method for exploring, explaining, and describing human-environment interactions in context. First, I'll summarize the political ecology approach and its key elements using chains of explanation, tracing flows of value, and looking for structural constraints. And then I'll show the application of the approach to two very different problems. The first problem is the outbreak of an environmental pathogen in Ghana, Buruli ulcers, which can be traced in part to the politics of the global economic gold boom. And the second problem is the heavy use of environmentally problematic chemicals on American turfgrass lawns, which has its own linkages to regional and global agrochemical economies. And I'll summarize by showing the similarities between these apparently different geographic cases, stressing that the political ecology approach reflects the time-honored geographic dedication to thinking both about space and place. But first, what is political ecology? So, put in simplest terms, political ecology is an approach used in fields like geography and environmental anthropology, environmental sociology, environmental history, that stresses the way local environmental conditions may be bound up in larger scale economic and political processes. Political ecology stresses first that environmental problems are often the incidental byproduct of people's economic and political decision-making. It may not, in many cases, be the intention of people to cause environmental harm in their communities or in their places where they make a living, but that the conditions under which they make decisions may be heavily influenced by external concerns or constraints. By tracing the costs and benefits of decisions outward, away from their immediate geographic context, and into wider spheres and systems of interaction, we can determine the larger causes of environmental problems or crises. So rather than depend solely on local reasons for the outbreak of violence between farmers and herders in Ivory Coast, political ecology asks us to think about what sets the conditions for that violence, what larger constraints or pressures direct the outcomes that we see locally, who gains and who loses from the environmental and social conditions we're witnessing. Are they nearby or are they further away? And in the process, political ecology relies on three methods: using chains of explanation, tracing flows of value, and looking for structural constraints. A chain of explanation is merely a series of nested questions. Why did farmers attack herders? Because of crop damage. Why was there crop damage? Because of government incentives in the meat industry. Why were there incentives? To help finance a debt, and so on. Sometimes called progressive contextualization, this simple but powerful method merely invites us to ask what causes outcomes and what causes the things that cause outcomes, and so on. The resulting explanation takes the form of a chain with links that may stretch from a local problem to a regional set of institutions or markets, out to government policies or national conditions, and onwards to possibly international shifts or systems. Political ecology also invites us to look at a bad situation in which there may be costs and losers, and to explore and see if there are winners. And if there are, where are they in our chain? This approach seeks to trace the flow of value that comes out of an environmental problem, or crisis, or conflict. The terrible conflicts between West African ethnic groups are, in this case, the hidden cost paid in financing international debt. Value is accrued at the national and international scale through some local and often unobserved sacrifice. And finally, political ecology provides a concept to encourage us not to crudely search for people or things to blame, but instead to assemble rigorous explanation by explaining why decisions or outcomes occur the way they do. And this concept is structural constraint, which is a term referring to pre-given or fixed and often very difficult to change contexts, which limit the choices available to people or firms or governments. Senufo retaliation against herders in Côte d'Ivoire was by no means the normatively best choice, but it was one enacted in the absence of alternatives. The government scheme provided no means of redress for crop damage. The Ivorian state's export policy decision turned out to be a really poor one, but their options were limited by the increasingly stringent debt payment conditions placed on them by global financing institutions, including the International Monetary Fund. So the approach doesn't seek to absolve bad decisions, but to think about the levers we might pull in the future to make good decisions easier to make, like possibly changing the debt service plan for West African countries, for example. The implications of this way of seeing environmental problems is that human geographers have a powerful methodology for explaining local environmental conditions. Starting locally, we can trace flows of value outward in space and time along chains of explanation. And along the way, we can understand why people make the decisions they do, sometimes bad ones, not because they're irresponsible or wrong-headed, but because their choices are limited or constrained by regional conditions, politics, and the economy. And this can help us trace the linkages between large-scale processes and phenomena to help solve serious local environmental issues. Consider the Buruli ulcer. And this is a skin infection caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium ulcerans, and it's rife across many parts of tropical and semi-tropical sub-Saharan Africa. This disease is a very serious one, related to diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy. Victims develop necrotizing lesions on the surface of their skin, which sometimes extend to the bone as the disease progresses. The bacteria secrete an immune suppressant and cause surrounding tissue to slowly decay with infection. It's really gross. This is a nasty disease, and it leads to infirmity and an inability to work, especially where it breaks out on legs and arms. Secondary infections from the disease can even kill. Now, data are scarce, since the disease tends to occur in remote, poor communities very far from regular monitoring. But it's also increasingly clear that the disease is on the rise, and it's afflicting more people than before. Why? It'd be useful to think a little bit about the geography of the disease. It appears most commonly in tropical areas, since the bacteria that cause the illness thrive in warm, wet environments. Victims catch the disease from water rather than from person-to-person infection, and the disease can be found in West Africa, Central America, and Southeast Asia as a result. So it would be perfectly reasonable to suppose that the disease is one typical in warm, wet parts of the world where there's little access to good health care. That'd be a good explanation. In other words, it'd be tempting to simply conclude the disease is an unfortunate accident or a kind of physical geographic problem or a problem of underdevelopment. But a fine-grained geographical analysis hints at something more complicated. And it invites us to think about the political ecology of the disease. Specifically, Buruli ulcer occurs far more commonly where the environment has been altered, where the water, surface hydrology, and water flow have been changed, like where water storage has been implemented or irrigation has been developed for agriculture, leading to slow-moving or standing water, especially water in which people are immersed and working long days. So you're starting to get a hint. In Ghana, another country in West Africa, which is just east of the Ivory Coast, in fact, the disease rates are especially high. And they're growing, with an average of around 21 cases per 100,000 people nationally, which is pretty big. But recent studies suggest the disease is found in some districts in Ghana at a rate 8 times higher than that even. Why? What's happening in these places? Well, a close look reveals an interesting trend. In many of the places where outbreaks are occurring, there's been a significant increase in crude open-pit mining, sometimes referred to as artisanal mining. Artisanal mines in places like Ghana can vary in size, but they're very often small scale. They generally function informally. They operate kind of off the radar of regulators. This is a kind of mining that may account for up to 1/4 of the world's gold production worldwide, and it provides about 10% of the gold that Ghana produces, and gold is a very important export for Ghana. Research by geographers Petra Schachert and Heidi Hauserman from the Pennsylvania State University and Rutgers University, respectively, shows a strong linkage between disease and this kind of mining in Ghana. In Ghana, a prospector finds a promising site and claims it through a simple process, often paying a bribe, and he then hires a crew, and he digs a big hole and uses hand labor and a few front loaders to sift the gravel and the rubble. And mercury is used extensively in these operations. When added to the pit water, it allows more gold to sink through the gravel and be recovered by the operator. The upshot of all this is that there are thousands of small, wet, open-pit mines that are proliferating throughout Ghana, which is Africa's second largest gold exporter. And these are places where workers toil with very little oversight in warm, wet pits, perfect breeding grounds for Mycobacterium ulceris, and so Buruli ulcers. Now, what is driving the mining boom? First, of course, are the increasing interests of Ghanaian government to increase its export earnings. Though it's one of the wealthier countries in West Africa, Ghana depends on primary industries like mining or cacao plantations to earn foreign investment. And this certainly encourages a lax context for government oversight of the mining industry. But this is coupled with two larger scale global trends, and the first and most obvious is the run-up in gold prices over the last 15 years. In the year 2000, gold traded for less than $300 per ounce. By 2011, the price averaged more than $1,500 per ounce. This incredible increase in value has encouraged lots of informal, entrepreneurial, and wildcat operators to get into the gold mining business by investing in some equipment and paying some bribes and putting armies of workers down onto the land. So this overall boom trend had been hastened by the increasing trade connections between Africa and the rest of the world, along with the growth of new groups of investors. Among these, Chinese investors are increasingly important players, with growing demand for metals and rare earth minerals in production in China, along with the growth of an inventive and internationally active entrepreneurial class in Asia. There are a great many more people interested in developing Africa's resources. And though it's technically illegal for foreigners to own and operate small mines in Ghana, these international investors can get into the game pretty easily by putting a local frontman at the helm and paying a bunch of bribes. Whole communities of foreigners have actually popped up in rural districts in Ghana, feeding on the gold boom. And the consequence is an increase in cases of Buruli ulcers, to say nothing actually of mercury exposure, in the wildcat mining districts of the country. And while not all the cases of the disease are linked to gold mining, and while not all gold mining causes the disease, the set of links that connect the two together in Ghana are strong and have so far been immune to breaking through governmental regulation or international control. In other words, to really explain the root causes of an environmental problem like Buruli ulcer, we need to trace a chain of explanation, from the bacteria to workers in standing water, from standing water to the expansion of crude pit mining, from the increase in crude pit mining to state under regulation and international speculation, and from international speculators to the global system of gold exchange and accumulation. In other words, from a political ecologist's point of view, some of the value that flows in the form of the world's gold is an engine for proliferating a messy disease in a distant place. Though local things like poor health care and poverty are critical components of problems like this in places like Ghana, very distant global forces are also at work. So what might this mean practically for finding a solution to this health issue? Well, that's for people in Ghana to decide, but Schockert and Hauserman's work gives us a few clues. For one, we might want to help make ownership more transparent. If investors are buying and managing mines, then they can be held more responsible for health issues at the site. Because foreigners are not allowed by law to actually own land in Ghana, but effectively they do, it may require reforms concerning who can buy or rent land and how agents who act on behalf of international investors can be made more accountable. To that end, it might be important to think about the bureaucracies that govern land rent and sales and development. So it might seem odd to solve a health issue by looking at property laws, but in a sense, that's the power of political ecology. And of course, none of this is unique to agricultural or mining systems in Africa. Some political ecologies can be very close to home. Consider the turf grass lawn. Now, nothing could be more natural looking than lawns in the United States. They're found nearly everywhere, after all, and even in the arid West, and they are in fact the largest irrigated crop in the United States. They cover something on the order of 128,000 square kilometers, 31 million acres. That's 3 times more acres of lawns than acres of corn in the US. In a typical municipality like Columbus, Ohio, lawn covers around a quarter of all the land in the city, and that's without parks or golf courses or football fields included. So lawns do seem natural to a lot of us. Of course, nothing could be less natural than the lawn. All of the major turfgrass species used in lawns in the US are actually imported or invasive varieties that have come from Africa or Asia or Europe. They're by no means natural to the region, and lawns are also a monoculture. This is just a fancy word for the fact that that green carpet-like lawn typically only has one variety of turfgrass, like Kentucky bluegrass or Bermuda grass. By the way, Kentucky bluegrass is not from Kentucky, right? It's from Europe. Nature, as it turns out, abhors monocultures like these. So to keep it that way, we have to either weed out all the possible competitors by hand or use herbicides to keep them at bay. Lawns also make great meals for certain kinds of insects, so keeping them from getting spotty means killing insects, typically through use of insecticides. And finally, lawns aren't naturally emerald green. To get them to remain that way means they need to be fertilized heavily and cut on a regular basis, and this is because the greenest leaves in a lawn are actually the youngest ones. What all this means is that although it's not too hard to have a messy, scrubby sort of lawn, and that's the kind I have right now, to get the kind of lawn that's sort of neat and clean and green, that sort of lawn that many people prefer or desire, that requires a battle against nature. You'll need to use a lot of chemicals, a mower, and a lot of work. But you probably already know that if you have a lawn. The result is a massive use of chemicals. Lawn owners typically apply the same kinds of chemicals that farmers do, but they do so in quantities many times more per acre than professional farmers. These chemicals are often harmful for ecosystems and for human health. People also use a lot of fuel in powering their lawn equipment, to say nothing of the water needed to keep them growing all season. Lawns, in other words, can be somewhat environmentally harmful. A study by the United States Geological Survey shows that though runoff from commercial agriculture is a serious detriment to waterways, the phosphorus and nitrogen coming from urban land uses, especially lawns, is a serious contributor in many places. We might think that people who apply these chemicals do so because they're ignorant of the impact or because they really don't care. But this appears not to be the case. In a national study my students and I performed to explore this problem, we learned some surprising things. Of the hundreds of homeowners with lawns that we randomly surveyed and interviewed around the country, a great many of them did use chemicals and other inputs. And the chemical users tended to be better educated, wealthier, and have higher home values and income. But most surprisingly, those folks who used chemicals were statistically significantly more likely to say that chemicals were bad for the environment, for themselves, and for human and children's health, more than those who did not use them. I'll let that sink in. People who used lawn chemicals, in other words, knew perfectly well what they were doing might be harmful. They're smart people, and they're clearly reading the bags. Our interviews also demonstrated that people didn't usually feel good about their use of chemicals. Instead, they felt anxious or worried about the environmental impact. This is a strange case that raises a kind of perplexing question. Why do people maintain their lawns even when they might prefer not to? Well, if we look at this question from the perspective of political ecology, it gives us a way to move forward. What do people really think? Why do they do what they do? And are there larger decisions linked to larger forces in other places? In part, homeowners' motivations turned out to be positive ones. People reported to us they were expected by their neighbors to keep their lawns this way and that their neighborhood pride was on the line. It was an important part of their decision making. Notably, people who used lawn chemicals in our study were able to list more names of their neighbors than those who didn't. They simply felt they didn't have a choice, that they might face detrimental social effects from not keeping their lawn more intensively. This is a great example of what political ecologists call structural constraints. People make environmental decisions, sometimes ones they don't like or ones they don't prefer, because their range of choice is perceived to be limited, and this is by no means irrational. People reported they experienced a lot of pressure from neighbors to keep things up. In fact, if lawns are allowed to grow too wild in many municipalities, you can often be fined by the city. Lawsuits of neighbors against neighbors over lawn care are not all that unusual. People make environmental choices, in other words, but in ways that are always constrained. And the political ecology of the lawn doesn't end there. The flow of value from lawns also goes outward to the companies that provide inputs and supplies. Homeowners are annually bombarded by heavy advertising showing perfect emerald green lawns. And these are prepared by lawn care service providers or formulator companies who need to maintain a market for their products. Consumer lawn chemicals are roughly a $10 billion annual industry. The companies that provide these inputs are themselves under a great deal of pressure to maintain their markets. They're faced with ruthless competition, expiring patents, and other crises in their business cycle that demand that they maintain consumer demand. As a result, they work really hard to get current users to use more chemicals and non-users to overcome what they call chemophobia. That's a term we found in one company's annual report when we read it. And consider this last little geographic tidbit. North American formulator companies, these are the companies that formulate the chemicals that you apply to your lawn, are increasingly interested in expanding their markets in Australia and South Africa. Why? Because the growing seasons in the southern hemisphere are the opposite of those in the north. And this would allow them to expand the industry to a year-round market, solving one of the long-standing problems in the industry, seasonal constraints. And the chain of explanation spirals further outwards. the companies that produce the raw chemicals, which are sold to the formulators who in turn sell them to the consumers, they are also under a great deal of pressure. Global agrochemicals are expensive. They're expensive to make since their largest input component is petroleum, and that's a product whose price rarely goes down. So under constant pressure to find new, higher value markets for their products, these global giants are very interested in moving products into places outside of their traditional market, which is agriculture. For them, lawn chemicals provide a rare frontier opportunity in an otherwise brutally competitive global market. So the stubborn survival of the American lawn is in part because of people's culture and aesthetics. People like lawns after all. But even people who would prefer to keep them less intensively and for whom environmental costs might seem high tend to maintain them intensively. If we're worried about chemical use in residential settings like these, what do the lessons from political ecology suggest we might actually be able to do about the problem? Well, we might want to look at breaking some of the constraining links in this chain. Many people would prefer not to manage property through intensive inputs, but are constrained from doing so by municipal codes or homeowners association rules. And these are actually not impossible to amend. The codes could be changed. And that could be coupled with financial incentives for people to choose alternatives. In Las Vegas, Nevada, homeowners have simply been paid a flat rate for every square yard of lawn they remove from their property. Finally, some reasonable controls on what chemicals can and can't be sold to homeowners by agrochemical companies could be considered. So thinking in terms of the chain of explanation, in other words, provide us with several sites along which to solve apparently intractable problems. So, as we've seen, geographers can enhance their understanding of why landscapes like the American lawn survive, even where some would like to abandon them, by using a political ecology approach. This approach stresses that choices are constrained, that environmental problems sometimes produce value for actors far away from the place they occur, and that a chain of explanation helps link local outcomes to more global systems and pressures. And this also links the three problems I discussed here today to one another in a kind of interesting way. Peasant-herder conflicts in Ivory Coast, ulcers in Ghana, and lawn chemicals in America. Now, all three have qualities that are undesirable, but if we wanted to address any of them, at least in a serious way, we would necessarily need to look at the root causes that may be set in motion in places far away, and that's the key lesson of political ecology. It also makes political ecology a good place to bring our discussion of this part of our course in cultural and human geography, which has focused on the links between environment and society, to bring that to a close. In this section of the course, we've learned that environments, including the land covers of the Earth and even the Earth's climate system, set some limits and pressures on human society and history, but that people are constantly remaking those environments. And we've learned that population continues to grow around the world, but that growth will stop, probably soon. We've learned that we are indeed feeding the world's growing population, but in the process, we're radically altering the Earth and linking the world through a complex global food system. And we've learned that hazards like disease have distinctive geographic fingerprints, that they're sensitive to geographic variations in things like social vulnerability and poverty. And we've learned that local environmental problems and issues are often linked to global pressures and forces. And more generally, we've learned to think the way geographers think, using the concepts of space and place. These concepts and lessons will serve us really well as we move on to the next section of the course, where we'll examine the economic and cultural differences we see around the world. We begin that section by thinking about the global economy. Has the distribution of economic activity always been the way it is today? If not, what makes it change? What moves components of the economy around? To answer that, we'll begin by thinking about the world as an ever-changing spatial economy. That's the topic of our next lecture.